The Dark Scrolls. To the untrained eye, a Victorian marriage was a vision of grace and gentility. Picture a slow Sunday stroll through Hyde Park, a gentleman in a top hat and cane walking beside a modest, lace-gloved lady with her eyes lowered demurely. Picture the wedding portraits framed in dark mahogany, the bride dressed in white, the groom proudly stiff in polished boots. Picture afternoon teas, silverware glinting in candlelight, daughters taught embroidery, sons prepared for Parliament. It all looked so perfect. But perfection is a costume. Underneath the petticoats, the pressed collars, and the choreographed smiles lay a truth as bleak as soot and as binding as iron. The truth was this. For a woman, marriage was not merely a partnership. It was legal erasure. The law did not just ignore a married woman, it actively absorbed her. The moment she took her vows, she vanished into her husband's identity. She could no longer sign a contract. She could not own property. She could not keep her wages, nor retain custody of her own children. In the cold logic of British law, she was now one with her husband, and by one, they meant his. This legal doctrine was known as coverture, and it shaped the very bones of Victorian society. It was not a fringe idea, it was foundational. The ideal wife was expected to surrender herself to the will of her husband, not just emotionally, but economically, intellectually, and even spiritually. And yet she was told this was a gift, a blessing, the honor of womanhood. In drawing rooms and girls' schools across the empire, young women were taught their greatest virtue was self-sacrifice. They were told to guard their chastity, speak softly, and never question the order of things. Mothers warned daughters, obedience is love. Fathers reassured them, a husband will protect you. The idea was drilled in so deeply that many believed it with reverence. The perfect woman, they said, was the angel in the house. The phrase was coined by poet Coventry Patmore to eulogize his deceased wife. It soon became shorthand for an entire ideology. The angel in the house was gentle, moral, and entirely self-effacing. She never raised her voice. She lived for her husband and her children. She accepted her fate. Her silence was grace. Her submission was godliness. But behind the veil of lace, many women were screaming. Imagine a young bride, 18, perhaps 19, raised in a country estate or a townhouse on the edge of London. She believes in romance. She believes in the novels she's read secretly by candlelight, in love letters and rose gardens. And so she marries. She trades her name, her freedom, her family, for the promise of a new life. But almost overnight the dream begins to rot. Her husband, once charming, now treats her with cold indifference. He spends long nights at the club. He drinks. He visits other women. And she must stay, because to leave would be scandal. To complain would be hysteria. To desire anything more than what she has would be unwomanly. This wasn't just the experience of the poor or the uneducated. Even women of the upper classes, those draped in velvet and pearl, felt the crushing weight of powerlessness. In fact, their wealth could become a further trap. A rich husband had more social standing, more lawyers, more influence in court. If he was cruel, if he was violent, the law still protected him. Because the home, you see, was sacred. Not in the way that love is sacred, but in the way a vault is sacred, locked, sealed, and not to be questioned. A husband could strike his wife, deny her access to money, isolate her from her family, and still be considered within his rights. He was, after all, the head of the household. Divorce was technically possible after 1857, when the Matrimonial Causes Act passed. But it was constructed like a puzzle designed never to be solved. A man could divorce a wife simply by proving infidelity. A woman, however, had to prove infidelity plus additional misconduct, abuse, desertion, incest, or bigamy. and these proofs had to be documented, often publicly, humiliatingly, in front of male judges who treated female testimony as suspect at best and melodrama at worst. And even if she succeeded by some miracle of witness or evidence, she faced ruin. A divorced woman was a social leper. She lost friends, family, her children, her income. She might survive, but she would never again be respectable. She was the cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. Don't be like her. So most women stayed. They endured. They buried their despair in embroidery, in charity work, in prayer. They wrote letters they never sent. Some wrote stories, thinly veiled accounts of their own anguish, hidden in the pages of novels. Charlotte Perkins. Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper was one such act of literary rebellion, a chilling descent into madness that mirrored the emotional suffocation so many wives experienced in silence. Others turned to laudanum, to illness, real or invented, to long walks in the rain hoping for fevers, to the occasional overdose accident. Suicide among women was rare, but not unheard of. And when it happened, society responded not with empathy, but with scandal. What sort of woman couldn't endure her blessed life? The emotional toll was vast, but perhaps more haunting was the physical intimacy forced upon these women, acts of so-called marital duty. Sex was not seen as a shared experience in Victorian marriage. It was a requirement, a debt, a chore. Wives were expected to submit without complaint, even without desire. A woman who said no could be laughed at, or worse, accused of denying her wifely obligations. There was no concept of marital rape under the law. A husband could demand what he wanted, when he wanted, and it would never be questioned. And this wasn't just an assumption of bedroom power. It was legal fact. In 1736, jurist Sir Matthew Hale declared that by the very nature of marriage, a woman gave irrevocable consent to her husband. This view persisted for centuries. It wasn't until 1991, yes, 1991, that marital rape became a crime in England and Wales. So what did women do? Some rebelled, quietly. They found one another. In parlor rooms and sewing circles, women formed friendships deeper than the bounds of polite conversation. Sometimes these became romantic, though Victorian society lacked the language and the law to define such bonds. These Boston marriages, as they were later called, were not legally recognized. But they were real. They were safe havens from the suffocating roles assigned by marriage. In some households, women banded together in strange alliances. A wife might turn a blind eye to her husband's indiscretions if he gave her peace, or she might strike a deal, allow her financial freedom, and she would maintain the outward image of their union. Marriages became negotiations, not romances, performances, not partnerships. And yet, through it all, a seed of change began to grow. By the mid to late 19th century, a quiet revolution stirred. Feminist writers, thinkers, and reformers, many of them married women themselves, began to demand reform. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 allowed wives to finally own their own wages and inherit property. It was a small crack in the wall, but it let in light. Women like Caroline Norton, whose own abusive marriage and loss of custody of her children prompted her to campaign fiercely for legal reform, began to reshape public opinion. She spoke before Parliament. She wrote essays and pamphlets. She shamed the system into listening, and she was not alone. These early feminists weren't seeking to abolish marriage. They wanted to redefine it. They wanted companionship, not coercion, respect, not rulership, consent, not command. But they were up against centuries of law, religion, and culture that had told women to kneel and stay kneeling. Still, some stood. And standing, they laid the groundwork for the generations that followed. Yet for the average Victorian wife, even as the century neared its close, not much had changed. She still bore children she didn't ask for. She still lived under the thumb of a man she might have married at 16. She still found no escape but illness, faith, or fantasy. Love, as it turned out, was the last thing Victorian marriage offered her. It gave her a house but not a home, a husband but not a partner, a role but not a voice. And behind the silk curtains of her well-appointed drawing room, she dreamed, not of ballrooms or honeymoons, but of the one thing she was never granted, freedom. She didn't remember saying yes. It had been expected of her long before he proposed. Her mother had whispered about duty, about securing a future, about being grateful he chose you. And so she wore the ivory dress, allowed the ring to slip onto her finger, and smiled for the guests. But on her wedding night, as she sat stiffly on the edge of a bed, no longer her own, she realized something chilling. Her life was no longer hers either. Victorian marriage was not built for love. It was built for control, control over property, over reproduction, over reputation. And at its cold heart lay one simple truth. A wife was expected to disappear. Her opinions were irrelevant. Her discomfort was inconvenient. Her pain, unseen, unsaid, and certainly unheeded. That pain often began in the marriage bed. Sexuality in Victorian England was a paradox, hidden in public, yet ruthlessly enforced in private. Men were allowed to indulge. Their affairs, visits to brothels, and secret lives were all treated with a knowing wink. But women? Women were to be pure, passive, and obedient. The concept of marital duty left no room for consent. A wife had no right to say no, no protection from violation, no autonomy over her own body. The law, echoing centuries of patriarchal custom, regarded her as part of her husband's possessions, no different than the curtains or the family dog. She could be forced, again and again, and the world would never call it what it was. There were doctors, of course, male doctors, writing long treatises on female hysteria, a conveniently vague diagnosis often applied to women who expressed sadness, rage, or sexual reluctance. These physicians warned that women who resisted intercourse were at risk of mental collapse, that to be a good wife, she must yield, that to protest was unnatural. So women endured, and many suffered in silence. Childbirth became a constant and often deadly reality. Victorian women spent most of their adult lives either pregnant, nursing, or recovering from miscarriages. The average middle-class wife had 6 to 8 pregnancies, often more. In working-class families, the number could be even higher. Maternal mortality was a looming specter. With limited medical knowledge, poor hygiene, and male-dominated medicine that dismissed women's pain, many died before 40. Those who survived often bore not just children, but trauma. They watched their infants die from fever, from poor sanitation, from neglect in overburdened homes. They were blamed for stillbirths, for sterility, for failing their husband's legacy. They were shamed for breastfeeding in public and shamed for hiring wet nurses if they did not. Every choice was judged by neighbors, by family, by the very structure of society. But women were not only judged, they were watched. Clergymen preached from the pulpit about feminine modesty. Novels warned of the ruined woman, those who dared to follow their hearts and were punished with madness, exile, or death. Even fashion conspired against them. Corsets reshaped their torsos into unnatural silhouettes. Heels kept them unsteady. Petticoats muffled their stride. A Victorian wife did not just obey, she was engineered to. And if she broke the mold, if she dared to leave or even speak out, she became a scandal. Women who dared to seek divorce were dragged through the mud. Their sexual history was interrogated, their sanity questioned. Even their letters were read aloud in court, every sigh, every plea, every hint of longing for someone else. The goal wasn't justice, it was humiliation. It was to remind other women watching, this is what happens when you disobey. But some women didn't obey. Some chose exile over endurance. One such woman was Isabella Robinson, a middle-class wife and mother whose name became infamous after her 1858 divorce trial. Isabella had dared to express desire, not through adultery, but through her diary, her private, locked journal. In it she wrote of longing for a man who wasn't her husband, of dreaming, of imagining. She didn't even act on her feelings. There was no proof she had. But when her husband discovered the diary, he used it as grounds for divorce. In court, her words were read aloud, line by line, like evidence of a crime. The judge deemed her mentally unsound. She lost everything. Isabella's story became a warning, but also, quietly, a spark. Other women began to keep journals, not to confess, but to survive. They poured their frustration onto the page. Some, like Emily Davies and Josephine Butler, began to publish their thoughts, fighting for reform. Davies campaigned for women's education. Butler tackled the horrors of the Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed police to detain any woman suspected of prostitution and subject her to forced medical exams, while her male clients faced no consequence. The imbalance was staggering, but to question it was radical. Marriage was still held up as the highest achievement for a woman. It was said to be her destiny, her proof of value. Spinsters were pitied, ridiculed, or treated as burdens. Old maid became a term of contempt, and yet the number of unmarried women grew. Some by choice, some by circumstance, but all of them lived with the shadow of societal judgment. Yet from the corners of that shadow, a quiet resistance rose. Women formed reading groups. They taught one another to read legal documents. They shared stories of inheritance stolen, of sons taken from mothers, of cold husbands who wielded silence like a blade. They weren't revolutionaries in the dramatic sense. They didn't storm Parliament or march in the streets. Not yet. But they laid the groundwork. Even as the public celebrated Queen Victoria, the most powerful woman in the world, she herself preached domestic submission. Her letters to her daughters were filled with warnings against ambition, against unwomanly behavior. But some of her subjects were not listening anymore. By the 1880s, a new breed of woman was emerging, educated, determined, unmarried by choice. They wore dark colors, refused corsets, and spoke openly about their convictions. They wrote in journals like the English Woman's Review, advocating for property rights, access to divorce, and, eventually, the vote. Marriage reform was not just about law. It was about redefining womanhood itself. These women weren't against love. They weren't against family. But they refused to believe that to be a wife meant surrendering one's soul. They envisioned partnerships, not prisons, shared parenthood, not patriarchal domination. They imagined and slowly began to build a future in which a woman's worth was not measured by how much she endured. Still, the pace of change was agonizingly slow. Even by the turn of the century, most Victorian wives were still trapped in marriages that bore little resemblance to the fairy tales they'd once dreamed of. The legal victories, like the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, were monumental on paper, but took years to filter into everyday life. Judges, police officers, and even family doctors continued to side with husbands, perpetuating the same dynamics under a new guise. Some women adapted. They found subtle ways to assert themselves, by managing household accounts in secret, by controlling their children's education, or by influencing local charity boards. But others simply gave up. And those who didn't? They wrote literature became the last refugee of the Victorian wife. In the novels of Charlotte Brontë, Elizabeth Gaskell, and later Virginia Woolf, women found echoes of their own anguish. In Jane Eyre's defiance, in Margaret Hale's questions, in Clarissa Dalloway's quiet despair, they found the words they were never allowed to say aloud. And somewhere between the pages of those books and the pages of the law, change continued. But it was too late for many. Too late for the wives who died in childbirth, for the girls who married at 16 and never saw their 25th birthday. Too late for the women who spent 50 years in marriages they could not leave, mourning not just their youth, but their very selves. The Victorian marriage had promised them everything: status, love, security, purpose. What it gave them was silence. The Victorian era did not end with a bang. It faded stubbornly, like smoke that clings to curtains long after the fire has burned out. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, after 63 years on the throne, millions of women had lived and died within the iron framework of her namesake society. They had labored through loveless marriages, raised children in silence, smiled through agony, and disappeared quietly into history, their names etched only on headstones or census ledgers. But they had left something behind, a trail of questions, a pressure building beneath the floorboards. Because although the world had crowned Victoria, the image of maternal virtue, the widow who mourned her Prince Albert for decades, the lives of her female subjects were not cloaked in royal romance. They were raw, intimate, and quietly political, and that quiet was finally about to break. The early 20th century brought new voices: the suffragists, the socialists, the educators, the novelists. Many of them were women raised in the late Victorian world, daughters who had seen their mothers beaten or silenced, girls who had heard the bitter weeping behind bedroom doors. They had grown up with lace collars and leather-bound etiquette books, but they had read between the lines, and they wanted something different. They wanted to be seen. The first cracks had appeared in the law decades earlier with the Married Women's Property Acts, which gave wives the right to retain their earnings and inherit property. But ownership of one's body and one's destiny, that battle had only just begun. Women began demanding choice. The Women's Social and Political Union, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903, did not merely protest for the vote, it protested for dignity. It questioned not just political disenfranchisement, but social and marital servitude. It was no coincidence that many suffragettes remained unmarried. They saw what marriage did to their mothers. They had no wish to become the angel in the house. Others fought from within. Reformers like Eleanor Rathbone and Millicent Fawcett argued that marriage, if truly just, must be a partnership of equals, that women's domestic labor should be valued economically, that motherhood should be a choice, not a biological trap, that emotional abuse, even without bruises, should be grounds for divorce. They knew that the home had always been political. Meanwhile, in the pages of fiction, marriage was being dismantled with pen and ink. Writers like Virginia Woolf exposed the emotional vacancy of Victorian expectations. In To the Lighthouse, Woolf portrayed marriage as a beautiful but fragile illusion, an echo of something deeper left unsaid. In her essays, she demanded space for women to think, to write, to live unobserved. She asked daringly, why should a woman marry at all? That question had once been unthinkable. Now it was revolutionary, but legal reform lagged behind. It wasn't until 1923 that the divorce laws were equalized in Britain, finally allowing women to file for divorce on the grounds of adultery alone, just like men had done for over half a century. But by then, entire generations had already been lost to legal imbalance. In 1937, new divorce laws expanded the causes for dissolution, cruelty, desertion, incurable insanity. These were the very abuses women had endured silently during the Victorian period, now, finally, acknowledged as intolerable. But progress came at a cost. The women who fought for it were often branded unnatural, bitter, or unfeminine. Newspapers mocked them, clergy denounced them, family members disowned them. The idea of a woman who did not marry or who left her husband was still terrifying to the public. She was uncontrollable, unruly, free, and yet, slowly, she became visible. The post-war period brought seismic shifts. World Wars I and II pulled women into factories, hospitals, and offices. They proved they could labor, lead, and live independently. Some never returned to their old roles. Marriage no longer seemed inevitable. It became a choice, at least for the privileged few. By the 1960s, the world had changed. The pill gave women control over reproduction. No-fault divorce entered Western legal systems. The feminist movements of the 1970s declared that the personal is political, tearing open the old wounds of Victorian domestic life and examining them in the harsh light of modern scrutiny. And what did they find? They found that many of the ideas still lingered. Even now, in the 21st century, echoes of Victorian marriage persist, in subtle judgments, in custody battles that still lean toward wealth or gendered assumptions, in the stigma that surrounds divorce in some cultures, in the romanticization of wedding rituals, often detached from the lived experience of partnership. The ghost of the angel in the house still haunts bridal magazines and family dinners, but she no longer rules, because we now know her story. We know what she sacrificed, what she suffered, and what she never said. And knowing is the first form of resistance. The Victorian marriage was never about love. It was about power. It taught women to give and give and give until there was nothing left but shadow. It celebrated obedience. It punished desire. It masked control in poetry and lace. But even within that darkness, some women refused to vanish. Some wrote, some walked away, some raised daughters who would never wear the same chains, and some simply survived, and that too was a kind of revolution. So the next time you see an old wedding portrait, sepia tones, stiff collars, blank eyes, remember that you're not just looking at a couple. You're looking at a system, a contract that required silence in exchange for survival. A deal signed in law but enforced by culture. And remember the women who whispered behind closed doors, who wept into their pillows, who risked everything for freedom. They weren't angels. They were prisoners who taught themselves how to fly. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.